am talking to people of Kashmir without going there, because Kashmir is the place where I always wanted to go. But I'm sure that life will provide us with opportunities. So today I'm going to talk on theoretical chemistry, a tool for the chemist in the new age. Okay. Somehow my slides are not changing. Now it's here. So I am currently in IIT Bombay, and this is our iconic arch which says Gyanam Param Dhyam. That means knowledge is the supreme goal. So when you think of Bombay, you think of it's a very crowded city with its local trains and high rises. But actually IIT Bombay looks quite different. So it's situated in the lake, near the Lake Powai, and it's a quite green campus, and we have our own shares of wildlife. The waters of the Powai Lake contains crocodile, and leopard is a regular visitor to our campus. We call it the queen of the campus. So that's where I am in, and I am by training is a chemist. So I had both my MSc and PhD degree in chemistry. So I am a chemist, but I am not the chemist who works on lab. So I am this kind of a chemist who sits in front of a computer and do work in a computer. So I'm a lazy kind of a chemist. Now, generally, chemist has a very low reputation of theoretical chemists. They look down upon us as people who are lazy, who don't do any work, just sit in front of a computer. And that is from the beginning. So this French philosopher, whose name I can never pronounce, he once made a comment that any attempt to use mathematical methods for the investigation of chemical question must be considered as completely irrational, and it's strongly opposing the spirit of chemistry. If mathematics will ever occupy a prominent place in chemistry, an absurd idea that fortunately is completely unrealistic, this would lead to a rapid and irreversible decay of this scientific discipline, that is chemistry. So then the question comes, what I am doing here if mathematics has no place in chemistry? But he was proved wrong very quickly by these three gentlemen. Erwin Schrödinger give the wave mechanics, Werner Heisenberg give the formula of matrix mechanics, and Paul M. Dirac married the quantum mechanics with the theory of general relativity. And with these three people, it started the age of quantum revolution. Now, one need to remember is that all three of them are physicists. All three of them actually got Nobel Prize in physics only. But the good thing about their law is that their law is general. So that is not restricted to physics, chemistry, biology, or anything. For any system, if you can solve the Schrödinger equation, you know everything about the system without doing any experiment. Now, although we always call it a Schrödinger equation, what actually we solve is actually more close to the matrix mechanics formulation of Heisenberg. So we call it Schrödinger equation, but we finally solve it by a Heisenberg formulation. Now, all three of them are actually physicists, and one of them actually made a comment, again Paul Dirac, and he said the fundamental laws necessary for the mathematical treatment of large part of physics and the whole of chemistry are completely known. The difficulty lies only in the fact that application of these laws lead to equations that are too complicated to be solved. Now that means everything is known, is that we cannot really solve there. And his statement goes on to say, hence it would be desirable to develop practical approximation scheme for the application of quantum mechanics. Now, some people think that this is actually the birth of quantum chemistry, because what we do in quantum chemistry, we apply the laws of quantum mechanics to chemical systems in an approximate manner. I tend to differ in that opinion, because Paul M. Dirac was finally a physicist. To me, the first quantum chemist was Linus Pauling, and he did many more things. He is one of the two persons to own Nobel Prize 2 times. One of his pioneering contribution is molecular orbital theory, which actually can explain the chemical bonding. And we all know molecular orbital theory. We have even read it in schools. Now, and his book on Introduction to Quantum Mechanics with Application to Chemistry is actually one of the first books which are written on quantum chemistry. Before that, whatever it was written is actually they are books of quantum physics, not quantum chemistry. And this book was published in 1935. It's still available. You can search in Amazon. And that actually started the birth of quantum chemistry. Of course, if you do molecular orbital theory, you know that you are only restricted to diatomic molecule. If you do a lot of jumping, then you can go to triatomic at most. Like if the molecule does not have any symmetry, you cannot really solve it. Now, one of the things, Dirac was right that the equation, everything is known. It's just that the equations were too complicated. And so you cannot solve it even if you know how to solve it. But at the time when Dirac was doing, there was nothing called computer. But advent of computer actually changed everything. So computers are nothing. It's a device which can do simple binary operation. So this is one of these Lego made logic gates. This is how the computers used to look like when they started. And this is how a modern day supercomputer looks like. So this is a supercomputer in IIT Bombay. This is a Cray system with 1 petaflop peak computing power. And more importantly, is something is called its Moore's law. That says that in every 2 years, the number of chip in a circuit actually gets doubled. So computers become cheaper and cheaper. So it started with what is called basically an analytical engine. Now you just have Core i7 desktops. And in my eyes, I have seen so much evolution of the computer. So when I started, I have seen machines with 256 MB RAM, and nowadays even my mobile has 8 GB RAM. So the way computers has become cheaper and become more easy to access actually has revolutionized the field of computational chemistry. So you have the theory, you have the machine. What was missing was the man. And then comes Sir John Pople. And he developed the system called Gaussian. Why it is called Gaussian? Because it uses Gaussian functions to solve the system. And Gaussian is the first general purpose quantum chemistry package which everybody can use, not only the super sophisticated theoreticians or computer programmers. So Gaussian was a general purpose thing. And initially Gaussian was getting distributed. He won actually the Nobel Prize to 1998. One of the very few theoretical chemists to actually own Nobel Prize. He and Walter Kohn actually won Nobel Prize together, and it only happens once after. Theoretical physicist winning Nobel Prize is a very common thing. There is no surprise. But theoretical chemist winning Nobel Prize is something surprising because theory is not something inherent to chemistry. They always love experiments. Now, when this software package was developed, it was available freely through quantum chemistry exchange program. So anybody who wants to get it, they can get it freely. But things changed very quickly. So one of his students one day made John Pople signing a document, and like all of us, somebody we know, they told us to sign something. He signed it, and actually he gave away his royalty in the Gaussian. And so the student went on to separately start a company which actually starts selling Gaussian for money. When John Pople protested that knowledge should not be hidden behind money, knowledge should be free, even John Pople was banned from using Gaussian. So the person who actually created the software, he actually thrown away from the company because he was no longer aligning with the company. And this is one of the sad occasions when money and greed actually win over loyalty and knowledge. But it does not, like, you cannot stop knowledge like that. John Pople and his students went on to develop more softwares, which actually eventually become better than the Gaussian. And anybody who tries to develop a software which is better than Gaussian, basically Gaussian banned them from using it. And there's a list of chemists who are actually banned by Gaussian. There's a website, you can go and check who are there. Unfortunately, nobody from this country is actually on the list. We are not important enough, that it means. But there's a list where it is banned by Gaussian. And of course, it does not stop people from developing programs. People develop programs which are have similar functionality, and some of them are actually better than Gaussian. There are a lot of things. If you search in Wikipedia, I think you will get hundreds of programs. I just mentioned few of them which are important, like Molcast, Molpro, Turbomol, QChem, PQS, And the last one is my favorite, Orca. I will come to that. So we started with the depth of pessimism. Now it's time from optimism. So Enrico Clementi at 1975 already started claiming we can calculate everything. So he says nothing matters. You tell me what we need to calculate, we can calculate. He just passed away this year. A very charismatic man. I had the good fortune to meet him once, and he is a very inspiring man. But in some way, he was as wrong as the French philosopher. No, we cannot calculate everything. Even 30-40 years of his statement also, we cannot still calculate everything. But we can actually calculate, if not everything, we can actually calculate a lot of things. So what I can calculate? It is which cannot be measured. Some reaction intermediates are so short-lived that you cannot trap them for doing experiment. So you can predict that kind of intermediate, their properties, by doing quantum chemistry. You can sometimes get experimental results which you cannot interpret, like complex NMR or EPR spectrum. You can use quantum chemistry to actually look at the molecular orbital picture and try to interpret them. You can get a regularity in the data to see that why some data are not matching with the others. You can predict the outcome of future experiments. So designing of new materials, especially in drug discovery, if you can predict which molecule has a potential of being drug and which is not, you are going to get a very well-paid job, because that's a big money industry. If you can even predict, like even if you can make the number of possible candidates from 10,000 to 500, it's a huge reduction in experimental cost. So you are in demand. But to me, what is more important is that synergy between theory and experiment is generally enhances the efficiency and depth of scientific analysis. It gives you a complete understanding, which is more important than I think than before the fourth thing. So now how I use quantum chemistry. So if I have to deal with molecules, it's classically, when I say molecules, I say is a two nucleus system, a diatomic molecule basically, where I have two nucleus, these two blue balls, and two electrons, which is my red balls. Now I can represent them as balls because I am now treating them as classical systems. So I can predict their position and the momentum at the same time. Now I just need two laws to describe them classically. First of all is Coulomb law, which tells me how charge particle behaves, and second thing is Newton's law, which tells me about the motion of them, how their motion is related. So I can write the total energy as the kinetic energy of the electron, kinetic energy of the nucleus, electron nuclear attraction, nuclear repulsion, and electron repulsion. So these 5 terms. So this is how I should write it classically. Now the moment I go to classical to quantum mechanics, in classical mechanics, Newton equations are solved that contains position and momentum. And basically what I get is that from the solution, that how the position and momentum varies with time. And that is called the trajectory of the particle. In quantum mechanics, the uncertainty of the principle forbid us to know the position and momentum at the same time. I cannot know both of them accurately at the same time. If I know one of them accurately, then other has an infinite uncertainty. So basically what we do is that we switch to Hamiltonian formalism, and Hamiltonian of the system is correspond to total energy. Basically I can write the same. These are all classical Hamiltonians. So I am writing all the 5 terms: electron kinetic energy, nuclear kinetic energy, electron nuclear attraction, electron repulsion, and nuclear repulsion as classical terms. So these are still my classical energy. What I have to do now to go for quantum mechanics is that I take my first I convert all of them to atomic unit just to make life simple, and then I replace the momentum by its quantum mechanical analog, where I is an imaginary number, and position by its corresponding quantum mechanical position operator. Just 2 transformation. So I write a classical Hamiltonian, I transform the classical momentum operator by a quantum mechanical momentum operator, and classical position operator by a quantum mechanical position operator, and I am all set. Of course, there is spin of each electrons. spin is not something which is inherent in Schrodinger equation. Schrodinger equation never talks about spin. So we will put the spin by hand to make sure that it works by, it matches with experiment. We know experimental electron has spin. And remember, spin is not like an electron is rotating. Spin is a quantum mechanical property. It does not have any classical analog. So we don't know what actually is spin. We just know there are two kinds of spin, alpha and beta. If one of them is alpha, the other is beta. It's not like classical rotations. Of course, if you solve relativistic quantum chemistry, then the spin is inbuilt into it and you get spinors. But in classical, like in a standard quantum chemistry Schrodinger equation, there is nothing called spin. You just put the spin by hand to make your result match with experiment. Now, Schrodinger equation for the many particle wave function, this is of course the time dependent form when the molecule, like when the system is evolving in time. Of course, if the system is static in time, that means you can use the time independent form of the Schrodinger equation. And for most of the purposes, we are going to solve this equation only. Now, of course, now when I think of a very simple system, what I start with an hydrogen atom, but my molecules has many electrons. So I have a many particle wave function. Now, how I'm going to interpret a wave function? There is no interpretation basically for a wave function. What we can interpret is the wave function square, what is called a probability density, which gives that at a particular nuclear configuration, the square of the wave function actually gives me the probability where electron 1 at R1, which spin sigma 1 can be both alpha and beta, electron 2 at, so basically it gives me the probability, how much probability the electron 1 is at R1, how much probability at the same time electron 2 is at the R2, and so on. So that's the bond interpretation. And of course, because of the Pauli's principle, we know that we are dealing with electrons which are fermions. So if you interchange the position, it will change the sign. So antisymmetry with respect to the particle interchange. Now, next question comes, how do I picture this many electron wave functions? The answer is that we cannot, because our brain can only process three-dimensional quantities. Now, for n electrons, I have a 3n dimensional quantities which our brain cannot think. I even don't know how it looks like. So I cannot interpret the wave function as it is. And nobody can intuitively see a function of 4n variables because there is also 3 spatial coordinate and 1 spin coordinate. So I don't know how it exactly looks like. Now, insight has to come from elsewhere. And of course, up to now, we have not talked about orbitals. Remember, orbitals as an approximation. It is not inherent to quantum chemistry. You can do the full quantum chemistry without doing anything called orbitals. So orbitals are not necessary, but chemists, we like orbitals, and I will come to that why we like orbitals. Now, what are the observable? So the total energy is observable. And the total energy is that the energy that required to separate the molecule into non-interacting protons and electrons. Is it observable? In principle, yes. In practice, no. What we calculate in all chemical processes, in spectroscopy, in thermodynamics, everywhere, we deal with energy differences. And we let entropy, enthalpy, ionization potential, excitation energy, electron affinity, all of them are energy differences. We never deal with absolute energy in chemistry. And now, but still the question arises how large it is. Quite typically for a transition metal complex, it's around 10,000 to 10 to the power 5 electron volt. Just to remember, one atomic unit is 27.21 and 627 kilocalorie. Question is, how accurate we need? What we call as chemical accuracy is 1 kilocalorie per mole. And that means we need up to 0.05 electron volts. So remember, from 10,000, we need to take 0.05. In other words, we will need something like a better than 1 parts per million accuracy. And that's problematic. To get so much accurate values in the energy difference, you really need to use accurate quantum chemical methods. Now, the first thing, quantum chemical methods we know for hydrogen atoms is exactly solvable. For other atoms also, we can solve it with some approximation, but that's not the case with molecules. So molecules, we have to take something called a Born-Oppenheimer approximation, where we think that my electrons is more heavier than my nucleus is more heavier than my electrons. So my electrons is moving much faster, and I can consider the nucleus to be static. The same way we think that the planets are actually moving and the solar system, the sun is actually fixed. It's not actually fixed, but its mass is so heavy that with respect to the planet, it appears to be fixed. And the same argument works here, that my electrons are so light as compared to the nucleus that they are actually almost moving very fast with respect to nucleus, and nucleus is almost static. So that means I am now fixing my nucleus, and what essentially considering my electron is moving around to it. That's what I am considering in a Born-Oppenheimer approximation. So what is the consequence? First consequence is that I get a concept of chemical structure. Remember, I am considering my nucleus to be fixed. That means I have a fixed chemical structure, and I also have a potential energy surface. That means the potential which is generated by my electrons. Second consequence is that my one Schrodinger equation now gets separated into two Schrodinger equation. The first one is called an electronic Schrodinger equation, which only gives you the electronic energy. After you solve the electronic Schrodinger equation, and you put the same thing in the nuclear Schrodinger equation, and then you get the total energy of the system. So it's an approximation where you break down the single equation into two separate Schrodinger equation. One is electronic and second is the nuclear Schrodinger equation. Although we call it a nuclear Schrodinger equation, there the electronic energy comes as a parameter ER. And of course, the total wave function will be a product of the electronic and the nuclear wave function. And that gives us the concept of potential energy surface, which is very common to us for chemists, because we know that a reaction to happen, the reactant has to go through some saddle point, which is transition state, and then it goes to a global minima, which is product, and then comes the concept of thermodynamic and kinetic control of things. So basically, this potential energy surface is basically where my nucleus is moving, and it is moving in a potential provided by my electrons. And same thing we can do for spectroscopy. We have the ground state, we have the excited state, and from the Fermi's golden rule, we can actually calculate the transition probability, and we can plot it with respect to the energy, and that gives me the spectra. And spectroscopy is an essential tool for chemist. So we have a large set of spectroscopy depending upon what energy range you are scanning. So if you are using radio waves, you are basically flipping the spin of the nucleus, which gives you NMR spectroscopy. If you go to a slight higher range, so from right to left, if you go, my energy actually increases and wavelength decreases. So if I go to microwave, the microwave will excite my electron spin, so it will give me to EPR spectroscopy. If I go to infrared region, the infrared radiation will excite my vibrational mode. It will give me IR or Raman spectroscopy. And next is UV visible, which at least part of it we can see, and that gives you the absorption spectroscopy, MCD or CD spectroscopy. If you go to even more higher energies, 8,000 to 2,000 energy, so in normal UV visible, you excite electron from the valence orbital. And if you go to the X-ray region, X-ray electrons actually get ejected from the core orbital. It requires very high energy, and you require specific accelerator facilities. This generally cannot be done in a normal laboratory to do this kind of calculation. And if you go to even more higher energy, then the gamma radiation actually excites the nuclear. So that leads to Mosbaugh spectroscopy. So it's a variety of spectroscopy. Each of has its own advantages, and all of them can be predicted by this simple law that I calculate both the ground state and excited state by quantum chemistry, calculate their energies, calculate the transition probability by Fermi's golden rule, and then basically plot it to get the spectroscopy. And I can generate any spectroscopy I want. Now, so that means I want to solve the the Schrodinger equation for molecules. I have taken Born-Oppenheimer approximation. Question is that, can I still solve the Schrodinger equation? The answer is no, not at all. The Born-Oppenheimer Schrodinger equation cannot be solved for a closed system for more than one electrons. Even for 2 electron hydrogen molecule also you cannot solve. So we need approximate methods. And one of the most popular approximation is Hartree-Fock approximation. And that is actually the beginning of quantum chemistry. Now, Hartree-Fock approximation is something is quite simple. It's nothing but a molecular orbital theory. So what it exactly do? So it tells that instead of each electron interacting with one another, it is interacting with an average field of other electrons. Let me give a very simple example. In an ideal case, to know all of you, I should interact with each of you individually. But here what I'm doing is that instead of interacting with each of you, I am talking through a video screen, and I'm talking with all of you in an average way. Same thing what happens in an Hartree-Fock. Instead of individually interacting with each electron, every electron interacts with an average field of other electrons. Of course, this is an approximation. So whatever is missing is called, in the Hartree-Fock approximation, is called a correlation effect, and you can include it by perturbation, by doing variation, or using more accurate theories like couple cluster. There's an alternative way of which does not even consider the wave function. It can directly use the density of the system, electron densities, to directly go into the solution of the Schrodinger equation. So it can predict the energy just from the density. And of course, you have cheap methods like semi-empirical methods or force field method, where you don't exactly solve the Schrodinger equation. Semi-empirical method, you solve the Schrodinger equation, but with the experimentally parameters. And in force field, you does not solve the Schrodinger equation, you just solve Newton's law. So that's how quantum chemistry means. So if I want to solve this Schrodinger equation, I will first do an Hartree-Fock theory, which is my molecular orbital theory, which considers the average interactions, and then I'll try to improve over that. Okay, my slides. So I think I skipped it. So that is what I was telling in the Hartree-Fock model. What happens is that each electron is interacting with an average field V of other electron. Because it's interacting with a mean field, this is what it's called a mean field model. Now, what is there in the Hartree-Fock is that electrons which has a parallel spin, Hartree-Fock can take care of it, and that is called a Fermi correlation. But the electrons which has an anti-parallel spin, Hartree-Fock does not know how to treat them, and that is called Coulomb correlation, because of a reason, because we know that the two electrons, irrespective of their spin, they need to repel. But in Hartree-Fock, there is no scope to include this repulsion, and that is called Coulomb correlation, and that is generally not considered in the Hartree-Fock. And whatever is missing at the Hartree-Fock is called the correlation effect, and we use different methods of including the correlation. So if I have to describe you the correlation method in a very simple way, you can think the Hartree-Fock as a sea full of lavas. And the correlation is like, now few of the electrons is jumping from the sea to the sky. So that's what is happened. In Hartree-Fock, your electrons can only move in the occupied space. As you know, everybody in this life, be they electron or human beings, everybody need their space. So Hartree-Fock electron does not remain there, does not like to be there in the occupied space. So it tries to jump there in the virtual space. And this jumping of the virtual space is actually known as a correlation effect. And there are very sophisticated ways to deal with the correlation effect. And of course, as I told, that we can actually come in the same description by using the density functional theory. I will not go into the details of the theory, not so required. Details you can always figure out. It's better to know the principles. Now, one of the things with this wave function based or DFT based method is the scaling versus the accuracy. One of the good part of this wave function based quantum chemistry theories is that they are systematically accurate. So you can always get more accurate result at the expense of higher computation cost. As you see, as the accuracy goes up, my computation cost goes up also. Like couple cluster, what is called a gold standard. So, and Hartree-Fock method generally scales as n to the power 4. Next better MP2 squared scales n to the power 5, n to the power 6. N is the system size. And if you want to go to very accurate method, it scales n to the power 10. So it essentially means that if I need to use n to the power 10 system for a scaling method for a real life system, I will submit a job, and then maybe my grandson or granddaughter will come back to find out the results. So that's because the scale is so high. Density functional theory, on the other hand, is advantageous. First of all, the scaling is less than Hartree Fock and accuracy is higher. But the problem is that there is no systematic way I can improve it. So I don't know how to improve it upon the density functional theory. On the other hand, the configuration interaction, like the wave function based methods are very good. If you are ready to pay more money, if you can afford more computational speed, you can always get better accuracy. Now, as I shown that 10 to the power 10 scaling is very high. Now question is that then what we are going to do for big systems, and many of the real life systems are big. This is one of the this is a picture of one of the photo system 2 where you can see the chlorophyll, beta carotene and this kind of things. This is a big system and you cannot use any wave function based method here. So then the question is that what you are going to do. So then the question comes that of multi-scale method, like you can use different methods to treat phenomenon which are of the different length scale. So if you are interested in femtosecond phenomenon like ultra fast processes, you can use quantum mechanics. If you want to go from picosecond to nanosecond, you can do molecular dynamics, Monte Carlo simulations. If you go beyond, if you want to go to microsecond, you can use mesoscopic simulations, coarse grain simulation, kinetic Monte Carlo. But of course, you can use methods which are all the boundary, which is cannot be treated by force like a quantum chemical method, and also does not, because it's costly, and the force field methods, molecular dynamic does not give you sufficient accuracy. You can take an hybrid approach. So in this boundary region, you can do a hybrid approach where you treat a part of the system in quantum mechanics and part of the system using molecular mechanics, and they are popularly known as QMMM method. And these three strange looking gentlemen got the Nobel Prize in 2013, Martin Karplus, Michael Levitt, and Arya Warshel. So this is the second time theoretical chemist won a Nobel Prize, and they got the Nobel Prize for developing this QMMM method. So what you do in a QMMM method? So you partition your physical system into two parts. One part is where the inner region where the chemically important processes are taking place, chemical reactions are taking place, active site of an enzyme, for an example, that you treat by a QM method. And then you have an outer boundary, which is not so important. They are act as a support. You treat them as a molecular mechanics. And also there is a boundary which separates from the QM and MM region. You have to do special treatment for that kind of boundary systems. There are many QMMM codes available. I suggest to have you a look with the code ORCA. Why I suggest you to have a look at this code ORCA, because it contains many of the quantum chemical method, DFT, wave function based calculation. It can do QMMM calculations. Most of the QMMM softwares are written keeping in the view of the MD code. ORCA is the only QMMM software which is written in terms of the quantum mechanical code. So quantum mechanical methods are more important there. So it is more easy to use for a quantum mechanical person, because it can automatically parameterize the force field for you. It can help you to set up the calculation, and that's why it is more advantageous. It also has a molecular dynamics. It actually supports simulation of wide range of spectroscopic calculation like UV visible, NMR, APR, X-ray, MCD, and it is quite fast. You can even run it in desktop also. So I regularly do calculations on my desktop, and the best part of it is that it's free. It's free for academic users, so you can just download and use it. Of course, there is a paid version available, but that is for industry. For the academic users, it's free. And if you are more interested in QMMM, you can go to my website. There we have tutorials, we have parameterized force field files, and we show how to step by step set up this QMMM calculation. So this is a ORCA input file looks like. Details not so important. Now, after telling so many things, I think it will be a good idea to give you what kind of research I do. So I basically interested in DNS. So you have this nice double helix structure where you have the phosphate and sugar outside and the nucleobases inside. And this gives you this nice double helix structure. This is the original model of Watson and Crick with these two persons in the background, which actually helped them to win the Nobel Prize. But the problem is that this DNS can undergo damage. One of the common source of damage is if you go in the sun, you will see our skin got red. Of course, we are still fortunate that we have melanins. But if you see a person from US or abroad, they had less melanin. So if they go out in the sun, the skin will just burn. Uh, it will just like peel off from their body. So this happens due to the fact that this high energy radiation removes, so basically destroys the DNA. For a long time, it was considered that this high energy radiation fall on this DNA and then it breaks down the DNA chains. But later it was found out that direct damage is almost negligible. So what happens is that our DNA is surrounded by a lot of water. Our body has a lot of water. So these DNAs actually remove, so basically generates so this falls on the radiation, falls on the water, and these free radicals and extra electrons get generated. Now these free radicals and electrons attack this DNA strand, and that causes the strand to break down, not the direct radiation, because direct radiation almost never reach to the DNA because of this surrounding water molecules. And once these DNAs break down, it leads to this plethora of processes where it generates free radical, OH radical, and E aqueous, and both of them actually breaks down the DNA. And once our DNA get broken down, it can happen two things: the cell can damage, cell can die basically, or the cell can start to divide in a rapid uncontrolled way, and what is commonly known as cancer. Cancer is not a new disease. Cancer is something which is 5,000 years old. If you are interested to know more about cancer, you can actually consult this very nice book, The Emperor of All Melodies, a biography of cancer by Siddharth Mukherjee. He tells us that cancer is at least a 5,000-year-old disease. With earliest specimen find in Egypt, we see that it's at least 5,000 years old. But now in modern times, because of the use of more and more electronic devices, the radiation penetration to our body has increased, and these days we see so many people are having cancer. So to understand how this radiation damage happens in our body is one of the crucial important process in cancer treatment and its prevention. So my primary research interest is to understand how this electron attachment processes happens. Of course, I deal with very simple models, and as they say, a model is a lie which helps you to see the truth. And so what we've shown that is that when this electron attachment to this DNA happen, first the electron remains away from the nuclear framework, like it's a dipole bound anion, and then it gets transferred to a state where the electron is localized on the nuclear framework. So these dipole bound states, which first captures the electrons, they acts as a doorway. So these are the doorway through which the electron enters the molecule, and then it gets transferred to the main backbone of the molecule. So we call it a doorway mechanism. And in this case, because the two potential energy surface comes very close, here the Born-Oppenheimer approximation breaks down. So the things we discuss about Born-Oppenheimer approximation, these are not valid here. So you have to go beyond non-Oppenheimer approximation to explain this kind of systems. Of course, it was already known that this kind of things happen in gas phase. We are actually the first to show that this mechanism in general, and it actually happens in real life biological system also, where you have a lot of water, then this water bound state acts as a doorway, and then the electron attachment happens to this DNAs. So this is how the radiation damage actually start in our body. We published quite a few papers during my last 2-3 years of stay in IIT Bombay. These are the just recent ones. We published more actually. I am not going to bore you with what I do. That we can discuss one-to-one. This is my research group, and whatever paper I published is their hard work. Of course, this picture was 2019 December, where the COVID-19 was not there, and we can still go out. I don't think we had a outing in last 1.5 years. But if any of you want to visit IIT Bombay, there are a lot of opportunities to do that. We take a PhD student, we take both through GRF as well as institute fellowships. We have postdoctoral position, they are decently paid. So anybody after their PhD want to join IIT Bombay, they can do that. And of course, every summer we offered paid internship. This summer it obviously did not happen because of the COVID thing, but we offer paid internship, which is sponsored by IIT Bombay, to spend few months in summer to normally to the MSc student from other place to there. Now, I talk all about the present, past and the present. Now, question is where we are going from here and what is the future? The future is twofold. First is machine learning, and machine learning has become so powerful in these days. You search something in the Google, and depending upon your search history, Google already start to complete the sentence. So that's what is machine learning as an artificial intelligence. And second thing is the quantum computer. So this is the this is the IBM quantum computer, and which can actually solve equation much faster than the one classical computers can do. And these two things can revolutionize the field of quantum chemistry. These days, without doing any calculation, you can predict the result of an experiment just by doing machine learning or using artificial intelligence softwares. And artificial intelligence will help you to develop better and better approximation. And quantum computers is going to solve problems. So you can do now calculations on systems which you cannot do with classical computers. So your horizon has totally now changed. But this is not going to happen easily, because the codes which are written for classical computers, they are not going to run for quantum computers. And use of artificial intelligence will require writing new programs and developing new algorithms. So a lot of trained manpower will be required in this field. So if any of you can learn artificial intelligence or quantum computing, there's a big chance that you will get very high paid jobs. And remember, if you go to the programming aspect of quantum chemistry, they really pay you well, because that is software engineering and very few people can do that. So there'll be a lot of trained manpower will be required in the next decade. There'll be a lot of job opportunities. So any of you can, if you can learn that, there's a very bright future which is awaiting you. So I want to end here. I of course want to acknowledge the organizers, especially Professor Manzoor Dar, with whom I spent a very nice time during my PhD career. Of course, my student, all the funding agencies with whose money I do my research, and of course, all of you for your kind attention and patience. I'll be very happy if you have any questions.
So, thanks, Professor Achintya Datta, for such a nice talk and throwing light on the use of basically quantum chemistry in dealing with chemical problems. There are other theoretical techniques which are basically molecular dynamics based, which we didn't touch in this talk, or some throw light on that. So if we have any questions, Dr. Majid, you can speculate them.
Yes, sir. Sir, we have first question from Shahid Bhatt. Sir, can we change the base sequence of DNA?
Okay, can you reiterate your question so that I can understand it better?
So he wants to answer. Can I put it to Achintya that the questioner wants to ask, can we change the base sequence in the DNA?
DNA can have different base sequence, and this different base sequence makes us the human being or any living being we are. Like you become you because of your DNA sequence, I become I because of our DNA sequence. Now this DNA sequence actually passes from like our parents, and it will be passed over to our next generation. Of course, while passing, it undergoes changes, and these changes are slow, and that's what is called an evolution. Now, if you do a rapid change in these things, of course, you will repair it. When I talk of damage, I was almost in a very simple way that if you put radiation, then it destroy the DNA. It does not happen. Our body has a very robust repair mechanism. So even if you go to sunlight, your body knows how to deal with it. It will deal it. So yes, you can change the sequence. It will produce effects on your body, but your body knows how to deal with it. And this change in the DNA sequence is actually what makes the evolution going. So what we tell this coronavirus, let us give a recent example where we call the coronavirus beta variant, delta variant, alpha variant. They are nothing there. They undergo slight change in the DNA sequencing while in our body. So it interacts with the DNA of our body and it undergoes slight change in the sequencing. And this slight change in the sequencing make them more adapt to the environment and they become more lethal. So the change is always been happening now in our DNAs.
Sir, another question from Insha. What is the difference between dynamic and non-dynamic correlation?
Okay, that's a question actually. Okay, so the definition of correlation is very straightforward. Whatever is missing in Hartree-Fock is correlation. No ambiguity in that. Now, the moment I come to dynamic correlation and non-dynamic or static correlation, so what I call as dynamic correlation is the correlation. Okay, let me share my screen again and go back to my slide. That may help me to explain it a little bit better. Yeah, so I was showing this picture that in the Hartree-Fock, my electrons are just localized here, my occupied orbital. So the correlation which arises due to this electrons jumping into the unoccupied orbitals, and that means there is some motion is happening, they are dynamic correlation. So when my electron jumps from occupied to the virtual orbital, occupied to the unoccupied orbital, they give me dynamic correlation. What is static correlation? This is a Hartree-Fock picture. In Hartree-Fock, I am assuming that one single determinant can describe the wave function. That's an approximation. Actually, my wave function is multi-determinant. One determinant is not enough. You need actually multiple determinants. So the correlation which arises due to this interaction of the multiple determinant is called static correlation. So when it is correlation is due to the movement of electron within a single determinant, that is dynamic. When the correlation arises due to the interaction of more than one determinant, that is static. That's what the definition of static and dynamic. But remember, static and dynamic correlation, they are very qualitative separation. You cannot exactly separate them. You cannot really quantify that this is static and this is dynamic. These are qualitative separations. Of course, what you can always tell exactly that what is correlation, and the answer is very simple. Whatever is missing in the Hartree-Fock is actually correlation. Now, how you want to separate into static and dynamic, it depends upon you.
Okay, do we have any other question? I think.
Sir, we have another question, but how, sir, we have this, how is ML different from computational chemistry at basic level?
Okay,
Like computational calculation are based on QM principles. What about ML?
Okay, so it's like an egg first or chicken first problem. So in quantum chemistry, we calculate. So in quantum chemistry, we perform calculation. We generate the data, and from that data, we try to interpret the experiments. In machine learning, you already have you use existing data. From the data, you find out some kind of pattern, and with that pattern, you want to predict new experiment or new behavior. Let me give you a very simple example. All of us who are do organic reaction, we put these nice arrows and write reaction. Right, this electron goes from this bond to this bond, and this product is formed. I am very bad at that. My organic chemistry is very poor, but that's how I remember I used to do that. Now, how do we know that the electron will go in that direction? Because our knowledge, we already read books, we have information, we know how functional group, how the principal electronegativity work, and our brain process that information to tell me that, okay, the next arrow will go in this direction. What machine learning is that instead of your brain, it is the computer who analyzes the data, and then it predicts that what will be the future direction. Now, where are the catch? Of course, a computer can keep much more data. If I have to mug up more than one book, I will die. Computer does not care how many books you give it, it will just keep it there. But where is the problem? Computer does not know. Computer is a stupid machine. It can only do things what you tell him to do. So it's your slave. It does not have any intelligence. It's a slave. You tell him that you need to search the data like this, it will search like this. It will, if you tell it search like data like that, it will search like that. Whereas your brain can process things, it can change the quality of the information, can do many things. Computer cannot do that. And that's why you need a lot of trained manpower who can tell the computer by means of computer programming, of course, that how it should process the data and how to take conclusions out of it, and which data it should believe and which data it should not. That's what is machine learning.
I hope that the person who was asking this question got his
Sir, I have
answer.
a question.
Another question from Afshana Hassan. Please ask a question. Afshana
Yes,
Hassan.
I want to ask the Achanya Kumar Datta Sarji a question. I want to ask him about this quantum chemistry software package, Orca. Yeah, so I want to ask you that how it can help me in my computational calculations regarding the transition metals. I mean the open shell transition metals using the self-consistent field method. I mean, is there any problem in the conversions in this method using this package?
Okay, so one of the reason Orca was written is to treat with transition metal complexes. So one of the first developer of Orca was like my postdoc was. He was an experimental, so he did his PhD in inorganic chemistry. He was an experimentalist, and he wanted to do some calculation. So no software could not do that. So that's why he started writing his own software, Orca. And one of the main aim of Orca is to deal transition metal complexes, and that is to open shell. So open shell things are very robust in Orca. It has a very detailed manual how to do the calculations because I think it has almost 1,000-page manual now. And it also has a very active forum. So if you are facing any problem with the convergence, with the setting up calculation, or you cannot interpret the result, you can just post it on the forum. One of the developers or some of the users will answer you. So that's how things, and this feedback from the user is also important to us, that where our program is working and where it's not, so we'll fix it. So it's a two-way traffic, but you can always install it. It's quite good for transition metal complexes. One of the good things is that it's very fast. So if you use Gaussian and if you use Orca, Orca always uses this modern approximation. That's why it's quite fast, and it has a active support because it's actively developed. So I think it's a good thing to do to open shell system and transition metal complexes with Orca. But again, preference of quantum chemistry software is a personal bias. So I can have my biases, you can have your biases, all of us are right. So it does not really matter. Up to the point it does the job for you.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
On the Orca, I just wanted to ask a question. How efficient is it in locating the transition states? Is it efficient than Gaussian in locating the transition states?
That's a very good question. If you ask one of the Orca developers, which includes me, I will tell them, oh, it's super good. But I will tell that it still cannot beat Gaussian. But it has some advantages, like it has this NEB kind of methods, which are quite robust. And that's why, which is still not available with the Gaussian.
So it uses the NEB type of
method
to
find the transition state. So
one more thing that I wanted to ask is that in Gaussian, I have always faced the problem to do the restricted open shell calculations for transition metals. It never converges. The SCF always does. It never converges. You always have to rely on the unrestricted calculations. Does Orca converge SCF calculations converge for transition metals?
Yes, Orca is traditionally designed for treating restricted open shell thing. Okay, but although it becomes too technical, the easiest way to converge ROHF orbital is to use CAS-SCF. If you use a complete active space method with one electron in one active orbital, then it is nothing but an ROHF. So that's where it becomes more easier to converge.
Sir, we have another question from student in Hartree-Fock method. If electron is having different spin, how these can occupy orbitals?
Okay, so let me understand the question correctly. So you are asking that if in Hartree-Fock electrons has different spin, how I can put them in orbitals, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. There are two ways of doing it. One thing is that I can take a restricted approach where I pair each of the electrons. So that means my electrons has the same spatial part but different spin part. That is called a restricted approach. If all the electrons are paired, it's called restricted Hartree-Fock. If few of the electrons are unpaired, then it's called restricted open shell. So the electrons which are unpaired, they are unpaired, but rest of the electrons has the same spatial part. So it's like a standard CO2 or like N2 or CO, where I put 2 electrons in the same molecular orbitals. On the other hand, I can use an orbitals where the spatial part, like for each, let's say H2 molecule, the spatial part and the spin part for the 2 electrons are different. There is no restriction, no reason to put them same, right? Like nothing tells me that that has to be same. So I can consider them to be different. In that case, I have 2 sets of electron, alpha electron and beta set of electrons. Their spatial part is very similar but not identical. So there is a difference. Now, what is the advantage and what is the disadvantage? When I consider that my spatial part of the 2 electrons in the same orbital can be different, that means I have now greater flexibility in the wave function. So I can describe the system in a much more robust way. What is the disadvantage? When they are in the same spatial orbital, my alpha and beta spin exactly going to cancel out. So I can tell what is the total spin of the system. Like for a closed shell molecule, I can say the total spin is 0. But if the spatial parts are not same, then my alpha and beta electrons are not going to exactly cancel each other. So you will have a different spin than what it should be. So you have this non-integer spin sometime, and that is called a spin contamination problem. And that comes from the fact that there is no spin in Schrodinger equation. I put that by hand. So it does not come automatically guaranteed due to the solution of the Schrodinger equation that my spin will be proper. I put it by hand and I have to fix arbitrary rules to make it work. That's why this problem happens in the unrestricted systems. On the other hand, if you do solve the Dirac equation, do relativistic quantum chemistry, you never have this problem because your Hamiltonian itself contains the spin and your orbitals are itself contain the spin part, which are called as spinors. And in spinors, you never have this problem of spin contamination or anything. Hope I make it clear.
Sir, we have a last question from one of the students. What is new about Orca 5? Last question.
Okay, what is new about Orca 5? A lot of new methods, a lot of bug fixed, a lot of enhanced capabilities, and some new bugs introduced. That I should summarize. No, jokes apart, it will have more faster wave function based method. Like you can now do CCSDT quite well. It has now capabilities of doing advanced quantum. So not only QMMM, it can do QM calculation also, like an onium kind of a thing, what you do in Gaussian. It like you can combine any 2 methods to do QM calculations. It has a better optimization codes now. It dynamics codes are fast. It also now can do metadynamics, so accelerated dynamics with advanced sampling techniques. It can now treat crystals by QMM method. So we still don't have periodic boundary condition, but we can treat the solid state by QMM calculations, and it offers facilities for doing that. It provides a lot of new spectroscopic tools, a lot of new tools for solvents like PCM corrections for couple cluster and wave function based methods or excited states. A lot of new things are coming. But again, I think the first version will be a little bit unstable. So generally it takes few weeks after the release, because what happens is that everything, when we use, everything works fine because we only use our sample test sets. When the user actually start to use it, we found out new bugs, but they generally get fixed within a week or 2, and after that everything becomes fine. So Orca 5, it's almost, the release is happening after a 1.5 years. So last 6 months we are discussing the release is happening and nothing happened, but it's now on the door. So we are very excited about Orca 5.1.